Second technical glitches. So welcome to the Lubalin lecture series, the last lecture of the spring edition of the Lubalin lectures. I said that. We'll have more lectures in the summer, hence the spring. But I wanted to welcome you to the lecture series that's put together by TypeCulture, which is the postgraduate certificate program in typeface design here, the Lubalin Study Center, and of course the Cooper Union. The lectures and the archiving of the lectures is thanks to TypeCulture for their sponsorship of recordings of these. We have a great catalog of past recordings. If you missed the lectures from our spring edition, we have 2 that are virtual usually and 2 that are in person. So we had Amelia a few weeks back. We had Mark Smith talking about the @sign, and we had Ellen Lupton here a few weeks ago. All of those are recorded and uploaded. You can watch these, the past 3 lectures in the spring cycle, but then also watch all of the other ones we have going back probably to 2012, something like that. So lots and lots of lectures there. We'll have more lectures coming up in the summer, as I said. We'll have 4 more lectures. We have 3 dates pinned down. I'm just waiting to get the actual details. But if you wanted to keep an eye on this website, better yet, sign up for the mailing list, which is if you go to coopertype.org/lectures, or just in the footer, you'll see a subscription to the mailing list. We'll send you out emails with upcoming events. And of course, we have Typographics conference coming up. Wanted to certainly plug that. It's going to be a 2-week festival here. Our 10th edition of that will be in the middle of June. It's going to take place here in this building and the building across the street. So lots of cool stuff. These are some of the names that we have confirmed speakers who will be part of the 2-day conference. That's kind of bookended by a lot of workshops, tours, Type Lab, which is going to be in this building. So lots of really great stuff. And certainly get your tickets now. They're at their most affordable tier. So until May 1st, you can get the tickets. So if you go to 2024.typographics.com, you can get a link to the tickets. So I am going to present our speaker today, and we'll have a Q&A, as we always do at the end. There's a microphone here. I'll probably just run around the room. We do have an audience watching us on YouTube, so hello folks on YouTube. Some of our students are watching. So just, if you can, wait for the microphone. That way everyone watching will hear you, otherwise it's going to be a little awkward for them. What was the question? So just raise your hand, I'll run around and come to you with a microphone, but do stick around for the question section. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ryan Bugden, who is an independent typeface designer and graphic designer based here in New York. He runs a design practice with his partner, Michelle Ando, and they release Ryan releases typefaces through Future Fonts, a great project if you're not familiar. Ryan teaches typeface design through Type Sessions, his own entity that does teaching. He is also an adjunct professor at SVA, also here in New York. He's also an instructor here at TypeCulture. So for our students watching, they know Ryan well. So it's a good treat for them to see a different side of his work. Ryan studied graphic design at RISD. And typeface design at TypeCulture Extended Program before graduating from the Type Media program at KBK in The Hague in 2019. Ryan has worked as a senior designer at studios such as Red Antler and Pentagram, and he's here today to discuss the work he's done on the RISD suite of fonts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan. Thank you, Ryan.
Wow, thank you, Kara, Sasha, for inviting me here today to share, and thank you all for being here. Pretty good turnout. So for those of you I haven't met, a little extra introduction here. My name is Ryan Bugden. I'm a typeface designer and a graphic designer. I run a small design practice named R&M with my business partner, wife, and favorite designer, Michelle Ando. Together we have a typographic focus on branding for small businesses, local and otherwise. On the side, I independently make fonts. I've designed some original typefaces, and I've done a few custom typefaces for various companies and institutions, such as New York Botanical Garden, Instacart, and the Institute of Design in Chicago. But today I'm here to talk about RISD. So first, a little background. RISD, short for Rhode Island School of Design, is a process-oriented design college in Providence, Rhode Island. It was founded all the way back in 1877. And the campus is sprawling, occupying several pockets of Providence, but because I majored in graphic design there, I spent most of my time in this building right here. This is the floor where I first learned about and became fascinated with typography from my teacher, John Kane, trying to find out how many ways I can set one paragraph of text in a small white square. This is the floor where I learned many more things about typography from Aki Narosi, including what an M- is and how to use it. This is the floor I was first introduced to type design from Cyrus Highsmith. And this is the floor I studied under Clement Valla and decided to center my degree project around type design and music, making a fictitious musical type foundry. And not long after graduating, I found myself here in Rhode's Auditorium, listening to captivating lectures about type for the first time in my life, completely steeped in a community passionate about type design. And for all the reasons above, I feel immensely honored and thankful to be standing here today, presenting custom type drawn for the school that sparked my interest in typography at the school where I first found a community to hone my type design skills. So, fast forwarding, Gretel, a talent-packed design studio in Brooklyn, was approached by RISD to help them solve a problem. And by the way, this is more or less the whole team that worked on the project. They worked closely with the RISD team and research team at On-Road. I believe some of you might be in the audience. Andrea, Dylan, maybe. There you are. Nice. So here's the problem. In its 147 years in existence, RISD never really had a visual system with which to consistently express itself. So first, Gretel identified core areas in which RISD had an appearance. And you can see here, zooming in, there were lots of interesting things happening, but big picture across the campus of RISD, from the various departments to the cafeterias, there was no cohesion. And even looking at the sub-identities in type only, RISD had trouble keeping it all unified. There's a sea of DIN, Gotham, Caliber, and other typefaces that RISD couldn't make up its mind about. And I'm proud to say that back in school, I contributed to this mess with the logo for RISD's point payment system. My classmates and I came up with some different name ideas for the payment system. Now, due to RISD's historic affinity for profane double entendre, I wanted to call it RISD WAD, but as you can see, that didn't work out. But ultimately, I apparently refused to admit that the word bucks looks optically smaller here, and I just aligned it. But the most important piece of RISD's identity is its seal. It's complex but iconic. It's the primary signifier of RISD. And they got as much mileage out of the seal as they could. So many students have a strong emotional connection to the seal, myself included. At one point, I made a riff on the seal and turned it into a pin for my freshman year Nickerson 1 hallmates to commemorate our long-standing friendship. So throughout the process, Gretel had conducted several rounds of design exploration and managed a completely public repository for the RISD community to review and provide feedback on. Gretel did an incredible job of documenting their process and engaging all stakeholders in the RISD community to contribute their perspectives as the work progressed. And they explored several concepts, each with very different typographic expressions, juxtaposing old and new, pulling out the swash from the RISD seal, using layers of graphic intervention, surrounding content with a transparent framework, allowing infinite freedom of expression. The list goes on. But they were able to take one direction to the finish line, honoring RISD's style of pedagogy and its emphasis on process. They used layers in the system to create contrast between structure and expression, and they sought out to equip RISD with a sliding scale of expression by developing various visual devices and a guide for how to combine elements. And this work was all centered around the strategic framework of question to create, because RISD promotes learning to think through making. At RISD, the way the curriculum and its culture of critique is structured, students create and then question and then they create again. It's a continuous creative process, an endless loop. So Gretel had been using the typeface Cardone by Fatima Lazaro as a starting point for expressing the creative act as a transition from complete to incomplete and back. And Andrea Trabuco Campos and team developed a hypothesis that tied the level of abstraction to an optical size axis. And they had also made the decision to remove the rings from the seal, which served to give the seal just as much open space as the type was going to get. In contrast to the seal, the typeface needed to serve a more graphic purpose, most likely incorporating some sort of geometric elements. But at this point, the objectives were set. It needed to feel graphic, you might say brutalist. It needed to convey a sense of incomplete to complete, an expression of how artists make the invisible visible. And it needs formal solutions that diverged from the more typical stencil constructions. Before the latest direction had been established, RISD and Gretel had already put out feelers for a type designer to work with, someone who was a RISD alum. I had developed a proposal for a variable font family of 16 sources, but I wasn't yet sure how those slots were going to be filled in or how they would connect to one another. Alongside the type, I was also scoped to revisit the seal in order to make refinements and see if any harmonies could be established between the seal and the type family. After all, it wasn't clear how closely the typeface would need to resemble the letterforms from the seal and vice versa. As you might have guessed, my proposal was accepted. And with that, suddenly, the weight of the opinions of all of my professors and classmates I studied with in that building was placed on my shoulders. So let's get started. The first phase was discovery, in other words, sketching and exploration. Andrea and I worked closely throughout. He and I started by gathering references to discuss. We started looking at the history of stencil typefaces back in their use in the early 1700s in liturgical books. The stencils used for jerseys in the 1924 Olympic Games in Paris, and even things as impactful as Resolute from Nebbiolo. We explored modular typefaces such as Albers' Combination Schrift or Paper Schrift by Maximilian Debus and how it incorporated thin but sturdy strokes. The most interesting to me was Émile Javal's research from the early 20th century. He was an ophthalmologist who was somehow this inventive with typography. It was also one of a few sources of inspiration for my final project in type media, Spec, in which I explored abstraction and its relationship with optical size. So with those references in our back pocket, I went straight to the drawing board, exploring ways letters can lose information gradually over various styles. And here I'm exploring levels of inclusion for thin strokes and adding more of a translation flavor to see what opportunities that gives. I explored how various terminal shapes could coexist in the same family, provided a consistent letter structure, and applied similar logic to figures, seeing whether a counterform could react to the terminal form, whether graphic shapes could be integrated into the large positive portions of the letter. I occasionally used a grid of A's and applied black and white until a new idea arose. And I tried to see whether width or weight could have an effect on where features are introduced. More exploration into the necessity of serifs, I looked into ways the negative space could assert itself to the foreground by vandalizing stems. I also broadened my search and investigated whether letter shapes could still be read if their internal information was removed, and applying some of that logic to a few more letters. And then I started running out of ideas. I started sketching stuff that just wasn't useful. So I started to work digitally. The first thing I digitized was a spectrum of weight and contrast. Lower contrast on the bottom, higher contrast on the top. This was meant to be more of a conversation starter with the Gredl team. And as we discussed, we zeroed in on a contrast amount as weight increased. Many of the other areas felt like they were either over-indexing on fashion or military, so we found this sweet spot. And as I started to finally draw type, we decided on a limited glyph set to use as a basis for exploration. This would allow me to iterate as quickly as possible while still having enough for the Gredl and RISD teams to react to. I was the only type designer on this, so refinement was not nearly as important as breadth. And I think this glyph set covers RISD in uppercase, Rhode Island School Design in lowercase, and a few other glyphs. My first drawing was a fairly nondescript serif. I started removing features from the serif until it took on an interesting personality and texture without losing readability. I also looked at trying to draw an incomplete typeface with square counters. Looks pretty crazy. Investigated the effects of weight, and gave geometric shapes center stage on the letter form. I was really charmed by this G. It was at this point I realized that we needed to organize some ideas and form actual directions for the RISD team to review. Can't just review like random sketches. It was also around this point that I learned that in addition to Gredl and the RISD Media Group team, Joe Jebbia, co-founder of our Airbnb, and Michael Rock, founding partner of 2x4 and author of Multiple Signatures, were going to be at these meetings and giving their assessment of the work. So, round one. We decided to bring two directions to the meeting, one close in and one far out. So for direction one, Andrea and I built this hypothesis for a design space that was similar to the brief. It spanned text to display, incomplete to complete. And this direction was loosely based on the expansion model, which allowed it to have these little curl-ups where the join came close to the stem. I explored an optical size axis in which the middle style could potentially work at small sizes. And the incomplete began to look as if it was melding with the background, completely losing its serifs. And this took on a completely different personality when it gained weight. So there was a complete, a semi-complete, and also the semi-complete could also flex down to a small size, and there was an incomplete. And we kept the idea of changing terminals in our back pocket, rectangles, circles, triangles. And throughout the course of exploration, we made a point to test it out in the identity framework that Gredl had developed. Here you can see it used on the website. We imagined the small optical size could potentially be used at a headline size for a slightly different effect. Some incomplete. So I had sketched some key styles to show some of the breadth the typeface could take on. I wanted to make sure that with each direction I was communicating some of the key areas of utility and expression. For direction two, I recalled one of my earlier sketches involving a removal of internal information and decided to see if it could prove out into a type family. Came up with this idea for a completely cohesive family that would range from a relatively neutral workhorse sans to a high contrast complete, all the way to an incomplete. Each of these styles would have a full range of optical sizes. So I made a complete that ranged from low contrast to high contrast, and a second style, an incomplete that also spanned different contrasts and weights. The complete could simplify down to a relatively inconspicuous, low contrast sans serif. To a slightly more interesting and dignified high contrast. And the incompletes shared the same structure, but similarly to direction 1, felt like it was interacting with the background in a compelling way. And when it settled on a heavier weight with a medium contrast, it had a solid utilitarian feel. The heaviest style loses its bit of its incompleteness because the counters are so small, but it serves as the top end of my weight exploration, basically. Still pretty interesting. And the lightest incomplete was essentially like a whisper. So we envisioned this sans serif skeleton serving as the basis for complete to incomplete, light to black, small to large. And when we showed both of these directions to the RISD team, they found direction 2 to be compelling enough to focus on developing. Now, some of you may be noticing that this is not even close to what was on the title slide of this talk. That is correct. So round 2. Round 2, our plan was 3 main areas. First, a development of the chosen direction. Second, an attempt to sort of bring back the other direction. And then the third, a supporting neutral sans. So from round 1, we had gotten a few pieces of feedback from the RISD team. The pill shape wasn't quite feeling right. It felt too specific without any clear meaning or reason for being. And it felt as if some external manipulation had happened to the typeface rather than the letters feeling as if they were self-evident. Also at this point, we had all confirmed the need for a neutral sans serif typeface to support typesettings organization-wide. The first thing I did was change the counterforms and made them feel more gestural, as if the stroke had been tapered off. And we felt we were onto something, so I leaned in and made it more incisional. The forms had the same immediacy as before, but the flared serifs felt more in concert with how the incomplete portions presented themselves. So I went back to the drawing board and drew a proof of concept for the way forward. I also began to get excited at the possibility of having the typeface pay homage to the incisional letter forms in the RISD seal. And after that, I kept the exploration pretty tight, exploring lower contrast as well as how present the serifs were. This is the high contrast initial sketch. The lower contrast, sharper iteration. I was enjoying how well triangles were fitting in here. It's more subtle. And removing the serifs altogether. Apart from those main proposals, I had also attempted to reintegrate some ideas from my earlier prototypes that consolidated positive form into simple geometric shapes. Here's an initial hand sketch showing a sans and a serif. And here's how it materialized into a typeface. I was really into this, but we could not find a way to fit this into a direction. Some other sketches I did at the time, this one with a high X height. Low X height, less contrast. Many of these sketches were centered around me trying to figure out the system underpinning the removal of certain strokes, or just exploring extremes like weight or width. In addition to that incisional direction, we also wanted to see if we could make the previous rejected direction work. I made everything feel a bit more graphic and blunt, and went from this to this. And we also needed to remove any pill shapes from the neutral and make it look a bit more boring for everyday use. But we initially tried challenging the idea of a neo-grotesque as the neutral. I tried a quick Franklin Gothic-y typeface to see if it could relate a bit better to the serif, and also tried to relate even more directly, toning down the serif to something sans. And we entertained the idea of having the sans be an integrated part of the whole family. But the RISD team saw the necessity of a workhorse typeface that served a stark contrast from the incomplete to complete headline type business. So I went back to our quirky byproduct sans and gave it a neutral makeover. I went from this to this. And then it was starting to feel like it was playing a useful role in the system. Now that we knew we needed this neutral sans, we said, well, what if this is the base for everything? And we wanted to see what might happen if we performed the complete to incomplete on that sans. So I quickly looked at all the ways I could remove form from this low contrast sans, but the RISD team quickly noticed that they had used a similar typeface in a previous publication and didn't see much potential for its longevity. And by the time round 3 came around, we had saved the more graphic incomplete direction. Everyone had felt it was both digital and craft focused, while having even helpings of both kind of like old and new. We just needed to give it a little bit more sturdiness, especially in the thin parts. We needed to kind of investigate further how the incomplete to complete presented itself and start to use it on way more applications. So I started with a small contrast study and landed somewhere near this second row. And I gave it another drawing pass. This is before, this is after. And I applied differently shaped terminals across 3 sources, all with no serifs. And I drew a semi-complete that featured strokes that almost extend to their terminals. And we offered the possibility of keeping the family completely sans serif throughout, or adding serifs as it became more complete. And this is how we were thinking of the family's hierarchy, exploring optical size across complete to incomplete, but only swapping out terminals at large sizes. But this terminal swap idea felt like it was leaning more into graphic design rather than a typeface with a strong singular identity. The rectangular iterations felt like they had a little bit more promise. So we simplified the thinking around the family at this point. We started to roughly map completion to optical size, placing complete at the medium size. And this started to feel a lot more promising and useful. But I was banging my head against the wall trying to figure out where along the range of incomplete to complete to introduce serifs. Should the serifs only appear on the complete style? Should there be a serif semi-complete and a sans semi-complete? And also no one else was convinced yet. Which brings us to round 4. The problem was that the transition from incomplete to complete felt disjointed, with the spacing changing as soon as the serifs were added. I'm sure the solution is as clear to most of you as it is to me now, but at the time my preconceived ideas were fogging my judgment. The solution was more serifs. So now we could have an incomplete for special use, a semi-complete for everyday headline use, and a complete for more readability at medium sizes, all interchangeable. Incomplete, semi-complete, complete. And we had finally solved it. We had solved the problem. And throughout the process of getting to this point, I had generated a total of 105 distinct OTFs. This is most of them on one page. This was the initial projected timeline with discovery set for 1.5 months. And this is the timeline after we finished round 4. So if you're a current or future client watching, please don't get any ideas. All right, so with the type direction lockdown, I was finally able to dig deeper into the details. The first thing I wanted to revisit with the Gredel team was the amount of contrast. So I made a quick study so that we could play Goldilocks and find the right one. I then tried tying contrast to optical size to see at which point size we wanted the typeface to shine. I also connected with Andrea to plan a more open and connected letter construction. We wanted to reduce the influence of the pointed pen and bring more weight into the stroke transitions. And as production progressed, we ironed out some of the letter forms that were drawing too much attention to themselves, and I gave the letters a bit more of a transitional contrast model. And throughout the process, there was always this looming question of whether we wanted to make a smoothly variable completion axis. There were 3 reasons we didn't end up doing this. 1, variable fonts typically use linear interpolation, and I wasn't technically equipped to build a typeface with a higher order curved interpolation. After all, I don't know many people who are. The middle states of that type of interpolation also wouldn't always look good. And also, we just didn't see the utility of it from RISD's side. We wanted to deliver a type family that was as simple and self-explanatory as possible. So with simplicity in mind, we started to discuss what structure the family should take. Should it have 3 distinct levels of completion, each with their own optical size axis? This seemed a bit too confusing and difficult for RISD to have to manage. Should each level of completion occupy a different place on the optical size axis? This seemed a little bit over-prescriptive, and it would kind of break the breakthrough that we had earlier of having everything interchangeable. Or should the serif simply live at 1 optical size? This felt the most useful because the styles could potentially be used interchangeably. And with that in mind, I decided to draw the 3 styles on layers, frequently checking to ensure consistent spacing and features. This is a proof I generated with Drawbot to help keep everything manageable. It wouldn't be a type lecture without a mention of Drawbot. After everything was drawn, the family was feeling cohesive. Both strokes and serifs were replaced by simple rectangles in the incomplete and semi-complete styles. And the sans featured many constructions that followed suit. Both the serif and the sans have strokes that connect smoothly to the stem and feature many strong horizontal or vertical strokes. There were many ways in which we wanted the sans and the serif to feel united, but some other areas in which we wanted them to each have their own distinct voice. So when building out the italics of RISD serif, I avoided slanting the terminals in serifs in order to maintain as much of its graphic quality as possible. I also made the serif weight consistent across weights. And you can see that the need to develop varying levels of completion forced out some fairly interesting formal results. Here's some of the here's a few of the more interesting glyphs. And this is the whole family together. At the end of the day, I produced variable fonts for the whole family and 54 static fonts altogether. The RISD serif variable font was given a weight axis. The RISD sans was completely baked into one single variable font with a weight and slant axes. And this is the whole RISD serif family. You can see that the complete, semi-complete, and incomplete styles are interchangeable here, which also enables the type to do things like animate onto the screen as if it's being written on. So I'll just step through these specimen bits here. And this is the amazing specimen reel that Gretel put together to show off the type family. Now, somewhere in the middle of this process, when the type direction was well on its way, I could finally address the seal. So the RISD seal was designed in 1951 by prolific calligrapher and stone carver John Howard Benson, who was himself a professor of sculpture, calligraphy, and design theory at Rhode Island School of Design from 1931 to 56. His aesthetic sensibility was first inherited by the John Stevens shop, which he bought in 1927, but his style quickly evolved into its own, rooted in traditional Roman brush writing, making good use of the weighted stroke of the brush, together with the V-cut of the chisel. And his son, Fudd, started working at the shop at age 15, and he studied sculpture at RISD. Fudd's son, Nick, also started at the age 15 and runs the shop to this day. This is a family of extremely accomplished letter carvers, having made work for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the John F. Kennedy Memorial, and the National World War II Memorial, among many, many others. And at the beginning of this project, Nick sent us several archival images of his grandfather's work. Here are some of his initial sketches for variants on the RISD seal. This is one of his first sketches of the seal, which resembled the one we know and love today. And this is the first official drawing of the seal, which I remember getting to see in person at RISD's Fleet Library. You can tell by the amount of whiteout just how much meticulous refinement was built into it. The first drawing has a total of 3 rings contained in the seal. The first digitization maintained those 3 rings but equalized their thicknesses. And while this version was used for a bit, the seal I'm most familiar with had already shed its outside ring. And Gretel's removal of both rings continued the seal on its natural trajectory. And when we look at the seal and the type together, both of them incorporate negative space, but it was clear at this point that the seal should not take on too many formal qualities of the typeface, which had developed such a distinct voice at this point. I tried putting the typeface in the seal just to see, and I do not want to show it. So, we set out with some goals. We wanted to refine what was already there. We saw an opportunity to revive some of the charming qualities of Benson's original drawings. There were also areas where we wanted to make it feel simultaneously more gestural and sharp for the screen. And because RISD was going to be using this at all sizes, we wanted to investigate the issue of scalability. And I think this quote from Fudd Benson captures the challenge pretty well. So even though he's referring to his stone carving practice, we were also looking for a type of perfection in the seal without sucking the life out of it. So when I first took a deep look at the seal, I identified some potential areas for improvement. First, I wondered whether the use of both bullet points and colons was necessary. I wanted to see whether we could make these more unified. And as far as formal characteristics, I was always curious why the various parts of the seal had different serif sharpness. I didn't necessarily think the difference in size warranted a chunkier serif in the medallion. And finally, the swashes felt a bit heavy compared to the RISD acronym. And when I started the drawing process for the medallion, I noticed all of the letters, when pulled out of the medallion, they started to look splayed out. But they looked so natural in context, so I recognized this as a feature that was definitely worth keeping. And as a type designer, I feel pretty comfortable in font editors, so I drew the medallion as a font and scripted a tool for myself that displayed dynamic guidelines on each glyph, so that I could get a sense of the mathematics skew and whether or not I'm overshooting or undershooting that amount of splaying. But the tool didn't make any drawing decisions for me. What you're seeing here is some dramatized interpolation. The guide tool just gave me more information about the distorted path that I was drawing on. It drew 2 dynamic arcs, as well as guidelines starting from the middle of the seal to the points on the top half of each glyph. So this is the medallion before, and this is my first pass. I sharpened the serifs, evened out the spacing, particularly in the 1877, and made all of those separators into bullet points that resembled the broad edge, as well as a callback to the rectangular forms of the type. And when I tackled the inside forms, I kept that same broad edge sensibility. So with my first pass on the seal, we reached out to Nick to see if he might be willing to offer some feedback. We met on Zoom, and he gave us so much helpful feedback. He noted how much stiffness I was building into the letterform structure and the serifs. He also drew an incredibly beautiful serif on a Post-it note in about 3 seconds, which is, So when I revisited the seal, I sought out to remove almost every straight line and build more flair into the serifs. And this was my next pass. But then I looked at John Howard Benson's work again, and I noticed all of the fine details reminiscent of his use of the brush and chisel. And when I applied that to every letter form, I had some interesting results, but the medallion was starting to feel way too detailed and fine. So I landed on a compromise somewhere in the middle. So we sent it back to Nick, and we got his blessing. So that was enough for me to feel confident in the final result and kind of just chuckle at the last part. So I'll just walk through some of the other tiny refinements that I made throughout the process. First, I solidified the baseline and cap alignment on the RISD acronym to give it a sturdy primary presence in the seal. I also elevated it a bit so they looked more vertically centered in the circle. I evened out the negative spaces so there wouldn't be any single offender when scaling the whole thing down. I also slightly closed up some of the negative spaces that felt unactivated to me in the original. I smoothed out some of the curves. I unified the serif appearance across the whole seal. I evened out the spacing of the medallion, which is a big puzzle when you're setting text around a circle. And some of the letters in the original felt rotated or at different heights along the medallion, so I made the letters feel a bit more sturdy to strengthen the ring shape, especially now that the rings were gone. And also, this is very minor and not very important, but the original seal had 2 bullets that were ever so slightly misaligned, so I just aligned them for kicks. So most of the formal decisions I made about the seal were borrowed from Benson's initial sketches. The serif and terminal shapes, the density of the swashes, the broad edge finish, the sturdy horizontal stress from the broad edge, the diamond bullets, and I tried to honor Benson's sharp 7s here. And the last thing we wanted to test was small sizes. My decisions around the small counterforms in the seal were scaling pretty well, but I wanted to see how far we could push it for small sizes. So this is an oversimplified list of my go-to moves for making a small size rendition of something. Make the detailed things simpler, make small things bigger, big things smaller, thin things thicker, thick things thinner, tight things looser. It's a tongue twister. But generally make everything a bit more even with less contrast in size, weight, and space. So I tried to apply some of that logic here. I wanted to see if I could make the small things bigger and make the RISD acronym yield a bit more of its real estate. And this is my sketch. I made the letters in the medallion more condensed so that they could get more breathing room and height. And in most other scenarios, you have extra space that you can kind of take over when you're making a small size. But unfortunately, the medallion was only running into itself, so this wasn't that effective. I also made the fine details a bit more chunky and increased the size of the bullets a bit. Here's a little overlay of the shifts. And when we looked at the full size and the small size version together, we decided that while it was sort of helping, it wasn't worth delivering two versions of the seal, and definitely not worth replacing the main drawing. And besides, Gretel had planned on recommending that RISD drop the medallion when setting the seal at small sizes, which already helps a lot. So when all was said and done, we could see a clear evolution of the seal from the past versions of it. Here's a morph between before and after. I can just watch this all day. Here's a detailed piece that Gretel put together. I'm just going to get stuck. I don't know. Okay, so with all of the ingredients finalized, we were able to start putting them to use. So as we delivered the type family, we put together some more examples of the type in use and began applying it to some of Gretel's existing layouts. We shipped the project and it became real. So I'll let you take a break from hearing my voice and just step through these applications. So yeah, I just want to say thank you very much to the Gretel and RISD teams for giving me this opportunity and being amazing collaborators. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Andrea. He was an incredible collaborator, editor, and champion for the work, and this definitely could not have been possible without him. And I'll leave you with my takeaways from this process. The original strategic prompt that set us off on this journey was question to create. I've worked on projects that were rooted in a sort of strategic guiding light, but this is the first one where the process itself reflected the strategy. The project had its fair share of twists and turns. You could argue that our exploration ventured out further than it needed to go, but not only did that exploration feed into the final product in many ways, some of which may not be immediately apparent, even to myself, but it also gave us confidence in the natural evolution of the result. So thank you all for listening.
Questions?
We got Nick over here.
All the way.
I'm very curious about the composition of the text on the circle. I'm assuming you made a font of that, and then you set it on a curve in Illustrator,
Yes.
Drawbot? Illustrator.
Illustrator. It was kind of difficult to figure out how to close the loop. I think I had to do some trickery with like a invisible space or a kern or something. I forget what I did. Justifying it or something? I don't know.
So the original had like that tapering out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to try it with a font, see if it works. And I think it worked. So
Looks good.
I didn't have to draw it by hand on a paper while rotating it.
Other questions?
Hi, great work, Ryan. I've been following this for so long. I just have like a quick question in terms of like the initial process, and could you speak a little bit about where did you draw the inspiration or like for this stencil typeface, and how did that come into existence before when you got into the development and the process of designing this? Because like reflecting back on a typeface that works for an art and design school, how do you think about now this working within the system, looking at it backward?
So first question is, where did the stencil typeface come from? And then the second question is, looking back, how do I feel?
How do you feel about this? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. The first one, it's pretty, I mean, Gretel did a lot, Andrea and Gretel did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of starting that brief for the typeface. So a lot of, like, I knew a lot of like what was going on in their heads about how this typeface was working in the system, how incomplete to complete was kind of on a hypothesis basis expressing itself. And the way that I saw it, it was kind of sometimes incomplete and sometimes graphic. But I think where we ended up, or some of my initial sketches, probably started from a place of like, well, what if I can do both of those together and try to unify that into one expression. As far as looking back on it, yeah, I mean, it's been like really crazy to see it in use, like across all departments of RISD, and just honestly, it's kind of bizarre to just see RISD use one typeface. And yeah, it looks great, I think.
Hi, great work. I have two questions. The first question, since you're a RISD alum, how weird/exciting is it to see that you made a typeface for your alma mater? And then my second question, because you're, I feel like, really adept at making tools to make typefaces, were there any interesting tools that you had to make for this project?
Yeah, I'll answer that first. So the only interesting tool that I made, I showed, but all of the other scripts that I wrote are kind of just boring production stuff, which probably shouldn't, didn't make it into the talk. But yeah, that was kind of like the big one for me is the seal tool. But I think the main tools that I was writing for myself as far as the typeface had to do with layer management and making sure that everything was going to be perfectly interchangeable and managing that from like a QA perspective. And to answer your first question, again, I just think like having my experience of walking around RISD is very eclectic. Like not only is it kind of occupying small parts of Providence here and there and kind of spread out, so it's inherently intermingling with the city of Providence, but also as an institution, it expresses itself in so many different ways, and it's just crazy to even just see them use one color or just like as a main color. Because at the time, like when we went there, we're like, is their primary color black? Like I don't know, like what's the identity, So I think it's bizarre seeing that. It's really cool to see that it has a face and also to see something that feels tonally appropriate, because at the beginning of this project, I felt daunted by the idea of trying to express something in a concise way that, from my experience, has been kind of all over the place. I hope that answers your question. I just went backwards.
Hey Ryan, appreciate the presentation. Really cool stuff, and also cool to see this work in depth. You had mentioned that you kind of opened up for feedback from peers and faculty, and so I can imagine you got a lot of feedback, solicited and unsolicited. Were there any memorable pieces of feedback you got?
Yeah, that's a good question. So luckily, I think that Gretel had an experience with the open discourse of the work being a lot more open than what I experienced. So for that reason, I'm pretty grateful. But we definitely had like Michael Rock and Joe Jebbia as kind of like the voices of the community, kind of like standing in for them. I think the crazy thing about this project is like normally when you have clients, they're just like, I like this, or I don't like this, or like, do more of that, do less of this. And this time, it was literally only questions. And it was both a gift and a curse in a way, because you're like, okay, so what do we do next? Like, so it's kind of the feedback was less feedback and more of like a conversation and kind of like provocations. I think on a very tangible level, we had a big focus on accessibility, which made us focus on having a complete and having one of the reasons we had a semi-complete, like we could have just done complete and incomplete and just gone full incomplete. But the reason we had a semi-complete is because we needed an incomplete-ish style to represent the identity and to kind of be usable on most headlines. So accessibility was one of the main reasons we had the semi-complete, is just having more information about the letters so that people can actually read it. I mean, if you look at this bottom line here, it's like, what is that? Yeah, I think it was mostly about accessibility.
Hello. Could you share a little bit more about the colors and the now RISD blue? I'm very curious as to how that played into the design. Was it in the first place or afterwards?
So I would love it if Andrea asked this. He's not far behind you. But so that was arrived at by Gretel. They had a beautiful reason for choosing blue that I will not do justice. Do you want to shout it, Andrea? And I'll repeat it back into the mic. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, all good. And plus, Dylan is here. He's at Gretel currently. We both, plus Leah and Ryan and the whole team, developed the identity. The blue was just the most obvious answer that I can give you is Rhode Island School of Design. And there was not a single color that had sort of captured the spirit up until the point where we did audits and sort of looked at the history. And there was a lot of a reddish kind of color that appeared throughout, but it wasn't dominant enough to have created equity. And as Ryan is saying, black was the color that was sort of the main driver. When we developed the blue, it was really to riff off the presence of bodies of water around the campus, blue skies reflected on the buildings, and just this overly presence of blue. And this particular blue is an ultramarine used in art, and it kind of combines the high and the low, meaning it's used by fishermen and it's used in sort of IK blue in a highly artistic and highly kind of sort of connotations. So it felt right for many reasons. It felt a very artistic, very kind of global color, and one that could kind of connect with the spirit of RISD. So that's the short of it. Yeah.
I was going to ask about blue.
If anyone cares, Rhode Island is the ocean state. So that's what they meant.
Just to give that comment to the viewers on YouTube, Rhode Island is the ocean state. It's pointed out by a lovely audience member.
Okay, I'm going to read some. These are the YouTube questions. What is your choice of real tools, meaning pen or pencil and paper? And then which software do you move into for type design?
Real tools wise, I love marker and whiteout, but I am increasingly captivated by the iPad and the lack of it having an inch of whiteout building up on top of the drawing. As far as font editors, RoboFont.
And Danny asks, are you looking for a TA?
For TypeCulture,
Danny, maybe you want to ask your question more completely. And YC asks, have you ever thought about simplifying the flourish on the RISD seal?
yeah, so that was one of my first thoughts, and the reason why I didn't show it is because it really somehow doesn't work at all. And I literally tried it with like in an hour and just gave it like a half-hearted try and realized that I think because I'm used to the seal looking this way, like the swashes are so odd and we're so used to seeing the swashes look like that, that it was difficult to change any one thing. Even the swash coming out of the D, I tried to remove that because that always annoyed me when I was a student there. But when I did, I was like, oh no.
Okay, Greg asks, how mathy are you getting with this design?
Quite mathy.
And Christopher Lent asks, what tools or knowledge were most helpful in the process?
Having learned type design by great type designers. I don't know. Type design principles?
And
Oh, also I would just say like having over the years learned how to work fast helped me a lot. And I think it at times was tempting for me to get into the weeds and kind of focus on details, but then I had to keep reminding myself that it's not like at that stage, it wasn't, especially in the discovery phase, it wasn't about the details. It was about just communicating ideas and kind of intentions.
Jin asks, was there a different direction explored other than the idea of complete, incomplete?
Yeah, I mean, I can pass this to Dylan and Andrea again, but I just briefly touched on it because I don't want to speak too much for Gretel's work, but yeah, like I came into the process after the identity framework direction was established. So lots of directions. Yeah.
There's another question that's almost the same. What helped land on the complete, incomplete concept?
I don't know if this is right, but I feel like my perspective is that RISD is kind of hard to pin down. So having a direction that expresses that is kind of, it feels right.
Seems like this is a ton of work. When you were working with Gretel on this process, were you only working on this thing? And I know you have a studio doing other work. How did you manage working on this beast of a project while like other work, or were you only focusing on this?
Unfortunately, I was not only focusing on this. And my answer to, if I were to answer your question about managing it, it wouldn't be good advice. So yeah, there was a week that I spent 95 hours working, and that was very not good.
Thanks.
So you briefly touched on it a little bit about throughout your years, you've obviously picked up certain kind of skills that help you work, whether it's faster or more efficiently. Obviously, when we're all designing in Adobe programs, you can smash 1,000 hotkeys like an arcade game to make you go faster. But when you're designing type, is there anything that you particularly note in your brain that helps you work more efficiently?
I think the efficiency comes from more of an intuitive, like having developed more of an intuitive sense from having those notes. And the notes are probably like spaces you draw, spacing, drawing. I don't know. It's kind of it's kind of a tough question.
I have kind of a specific follow-up.
Yeah, maybe.
For one example, going back to the text on the curve, because that's the thing I'm really interested in. When you were drawing the type, did you have some kind of system set up so you could proof it in real time as you were changing the glyphs? Or was it like you change the glyphs, export a font, open up the InDesign file, and make sure it's all like up to date?
So I am a fairly recent Figma enthusiast, and I just find it to be really terrible to open InDesign. I used to love the app, and it's the strongest typographic app there is. But like, I would just simply generate the font and then refresh the tab on Figma, and it's there. And a lot of the proofing on screen that we were doing was from Figma, which I don't recommend. It does weird things with curves sometimes, but again, like for that phase, like when we're doing like so many different things, it's kind of just, oh, let's just see it in use. And Gretel had used Figma a lot in their process, and a lot of the layouts that they had set up were already kind of there. So integrating not only the kind of like being able to kind of interface with them and then, toss font files back and forth or whatever, try it out on a layout, also build a presentation together, was just like all in one app is kind of worth the occasional curve glitch. But yeah, so nothing too fancy with like a script that automatically sends it to this server and then does the thing. But yeah, Figma.
Hi. So I'm a student right now at the School of Visual Arts, and I have not been able to take the plunge into designing custom work yet. So is there any helpful advice that you would give someone who's just beginning to do work like this or is interested in doing work like this?
Well, the advice that I would give would be very personal to my background. And I would say, because I started as kind of a brand designer, while also studying type design, starting at Type at Cooper, it was kind of a process of me learning the rhythm of kind of agency work, and also just bothering people about type and telling them that I like it. So that would be my main advice, is like, if you're interested in doing custom work, especially with branding, then having some sort of like branding experience will help a lot. I think in this case, not only being able to work fairly fast with type was helpful, but also just kind of knowing instinctively, okay, we kind of have to build a deck around this or a narrative around this. And it's not simply like, oh, we did the work, let's organize it. You're kind of thinking about how you're going to talk about the work as you're working. And in that way, the way that you have to, like having experience working with clients and kind of being able to communicate ideas to them can inform your actual work before you have to organize it.
Sorry, I have one more question. What's your favorite way to de-stress?
Favorite what, sorry?
Your favorite way to de-stress?
Oh gosh. In a pinch, I would say extended exhales. And long term, Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom.
So the logo, the seal, was created by a calligrapher before. So I'm just like wondering, like, what do you think about the relationship between calligraphy and typography, like in the process of creative?
I think like I kind of come from a school of thought that typography is deeply rooted in writing. So there's inherently a kind of relationship there. You can see from my earlier experiments that I was trying to, see if there was an option to do the type in a way that felt in step with the seal, and kind of not necessarily taking the actual forms from the seal and building them into a typeface, but instead just kind of knowing the roots of the letter form and building from there. But in this case, I would say that the typeface, while it kind of undoubtedly has a relationship with writing, it's doing a very different thing in the system than the seal. And that's something that we realize is nice about the system, is that we kind of have these layers of contrast, these kind of different elements that have a dialogue with each other. You have this kind of neutrally sans, you have this kind of more mechanical graphic serif, and you have this more expressive humanist, you might say, seal in the system. And all of these sort of things kind of express the range of expression at RISD. So I kind of digressed a little there, but yeah.
I have a silly question. When you give, the new system to a big organization like RISD, for instance, they take it for themselves and then they have like a whole relationship with it. And then they sometimes mess it up, So I was just curious if you've seen any like strange examples of people using it in all kinds of ways just because that's what, clients do basically.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily strange, but there's a few unexpected things. Well, we probably should have expected this one, but like the primary weight you might have noticed that we're using in the system of Serif is the light weight, and that's probably on me. Like I probably should have named that regular or something. But the regular is used a little bit more than we might expect because it's called regular, I would imagine. Apart from that, I've seen some interesting uses where RISD is kind of combining these serif shapes into one shape and kind of letting that unify a word. Pretty cool. One thing was one of my old, I guess I never had her. One of the teachers at RISD, Nancy Scolo, she made like a illustrated animation with that said 2024, but in like her style with the typeface, and like something about that just like hit me really deeply because I was like, wow, this is like a very respected teacher at this school that I went to, and like she's using this type in her style, and then it just connected for me because I think, I've been in New York for about 10 years now, and it feels like there's a time gap there, and just seeing something kind of connect it back felt really special, and that doesn't answer your question, but.
Hey Ryan, just a quick question. Did it feel like a natural stopping point at version 151, or was it hard to resist the urge to keep iterating because of the weight of the project?
Let's just say the urge was fading at that point. And we felt that 105 was a good number. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for your talk. I'm curious at what point you stopped just using your physical eye and were testing like exactly the serifs and like making sure everything was even. Like, was that in round 1, or was that later on that things were kind of perfected?
Definitely later on, and it makes me happy that that wouldn't necessarily be clear. But yeah, the discovery phase, literally most of those drawings were kind of like, I drew it, now put it there, and then move on to the next one. Like there was no second pass for drawing. So I think maybe the ones, well, there were obviously second passes on the ones that were trying to like start from where we were on the previous round. But the other kind of like singular expressions were kind of just, let's just get the idea out there to communicate. And then I just made a point to like not give in to the temptation to refine until we had locked down a direction.
That's helpful.
There might not be a good answer for this, but if RISD rebrands in 100 years, what would you like to know, what would you like the future designers to understand about your thought and your font and your design? And maybe, like, what is one thing that you would want them to carry over or even dispose of?
Wow. I think if it's 100 years in the future, they should probably start from scratch. Maybe keep the seal. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite character?
I was going to make a joke about a person or something. I mean, I tend to like lowercase a's, as you can see in the initial slides. Uppercase r's, which is helpful for this project. Just letters that kind of show a lot of the personality of the typeface. And I probably just lost a lot of credibility with type designers who are out there. Like, you can't have a favorite character.
Hi, just a couple questions. I'm sorry if you answered this earlier, but I might have missed it. What was the organizational structure of the hands involved? So I'm assuming you implied that you are not a part of Gretel, right?
Yeah, correct.
So what was the relationship between you, Gretel, and RISD in this whole client and agency?
So RISD was essentially the end client. Dylan and Andrea and the rest of the Gretel team were the agency doing the identity work, and then I'm just the type designer making the typeface and kind of refining stuff. So, when I put this, when I completed the work, I was like, oh my God, I did so much work. And then I put this presentation together. I saw the first slides, and I was like, did I do anything? Because the colors there, the type kind of has a similar idea. The seal, it already had its rings removed. I am not a huge piece in this puzzle. I'm more a lot of tiny pieces. But yeah, it was RISD, the client, Gretel, the agency, and then Gretel had worked with another research agency named Rhode for, I think, some other research and maybe more strategic side of things. But Gretel had their own strategy people as well. But yeah.
So are you a freelancer working with Gretel on the project?
Yes, essentially.
Okay. And then the second quick question is, do you ever feel, daunted by the infinite possibilities at the beginning of the project? You showed us the 105 OTFs and the million different directions that you were thinking of for the project. And so at what point do you feel like you're losing efficiency by exploring too many ideas? Because I'm sure you want to, and I definitely understand that, but how do you balance exploring all the options with being efficient?
Yeah, I think this may not be what you're going after, but I think that for me, it comes down to trust and kind of having trust in Gretel to be a good shepherd for the work and collaborator in editing it. And I really felt at the beginning of the project, I was daunted not necessarily by, I know I have to do 105 fonts, but more just how do I pin down this school that I know and love, and I don't know how to really describe it in words. But as soon as we got started, I knew that working with Gretel, we could just stay on track and make sure that we're hitting on the strategy, essentially. And honestly, what it comes down to is the brief, right? Where it's just having a brief, having a strategic North Star will help you, no matter how long the process goes, just feel reassured that everyone agrees that you're going to a specific place. And if everyone agrees on that place, then you're eventually going to get there, right? But it's a real problem when you have this person who wants it to be that and this person who wants it to be that, and that can really spiral. So just having some sort of lane that we were all agreeing to stay in really helped.
So you trusted that Gretel would keep focus, the conceptual focus.
Yeah, and they were super helpful in that, in just keeping it on track. They were essentially managing the whole project and keeping keeping time with the presentations and making sure that we're getting all the feedback that we need and everything. So could not have done it without that structure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably close out. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you.